You ready to start?
Yeah.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the Solar Seminar. Today we have Mick Abbott, Professor in Landscape Architecture, who will be doing the seminar. Welcome and thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for coming. And in some ways, it's great that you guys are here in the sense that it's you all know me to some degree, and so it's a chance to, I suppose, present some work that's ongoing, but in a sort of a conversational way, because, and that's what I enjoy about the opportunity to present in a seminar, that it's not like completed stuff, it's actually stuff in progress. And so it's a chance to have a conversation about ideas and about the things that are presented, as much as for me to say, well, here's supposedly what I know, because I'm finding I know less and less. Started with this image because it's a simple question, but what's that? And of course it's a trick question, but what is it? A photo. It's a Kia, an alpine carrot, yes? All right, we'll go into the landscape stuff. What type of forest is that? Beech forest? Yeah. And the reason I start with those is what I'm presenting to begin with is this idea of typologies, that we see typologies in all that we do. And even, you know, these are fascinating images of early maps by Europeans coming here, you know, that we see capes and islands. Sort of, we see what we see because that's what we're looking for, and those are the terms that we have. Or likewise here, I'm fascinated in Stokes' map. She did the first coastal survey of Aotearoa survey, in the sense that you know, here there's three solitary peaks. If you've ever been in there, the sense of a peak being solitary there is not. But of course, they were the three places he could differentiate as isolated peaks. So it's this sense of what we bring to the world frames how we see it, and then sense the sort of the purpose of what I'm going to talk about is landscape architecture in a more than human world. And I suppose that negotiation of the ideas that we have that we bring to the world versus that which is beyond our ideas or that we're engaging or exploring within. And so I suppose it's that sort of things we're less certain about and how we navigate that space in a design sense. And that term, a more than human world, comes from David Abram. And in an academic sense, I could now go into some sort of, you know, whakapapa of that term and how it's been applied. But actually, I think it's easier for me to go into sort of my own negotiation of that term. And so there's two ways into that term that I've found. This is a trip I did earlier in the year up in the Emerald Burn and just exploring the place and the photos that I've been taking. And coming into landscape architecture, as most will know, is I'm relatively naive about knowing all the names of individual plants, just like Kia or whatever, in the sense of giving them their categorization. But I've had a lifetime of actually encountering and navigating and being with these places and these plants and know them well, but know them perhaps in other ways. And so some of the places that you see, and I just have to show this because this is an amazing spot for 1.5 kilometres following this stream that's floods, I think, and all the water is underground. And I've never been down a stream for so long with it underground. You have it from time to time, but for that length of time, it was great too because it was easy travel rather than bashing your way down the side. And then all of a sudden, the water coming out completely pure, and of course, drinking that water and that experience within that. So if that's my sort of that more than human world in terms of, that's just a snippet of what I could show, but we're not here to see my photos from around the places. But this here, you know, rata leaves, I show that because it's an image I took partly because I slipped and fell and I was so close to it. I went, oh wow, that's quite cool, and took the photo of that. But also, I've had to clean up a whole lot of crap at home. Not that I've managed to clean it up. More I've done is just sort of sorted it out again. And what that's done is sort of allowed me to have a little look back as well. And so if I look at this in terms of designing and design methods, it's been fascinating to go back to my final year architecture work and find my portfolio of work from that. And I was just explaining today in class that I don't have the year before because I burnt it all rather in a pit or something. And but I do have this work, sort of like the thing that in here, the use of dice to work out the colonnade, throwing that we were given room dimensions that we had to do for this gallery, throwing them on the floor, and then these are the pieces of paper and how they're configured and so on. This sort of navigating of purpose here and what you're seeing, and the sort of the array of the world and sort of the fractal patterns and how they might play out, and sort of how we can sort of, I can see back then, how can I sort of question some of those typologies that I'm being sort of given with which to navigate design. And so pulling out some of my sketches of buildings here that I deliberately rotate around to change the orientation as I'm going there. I'm not really using much language. I don't even know what they are other than the forms and shapes and volumes and spaces. Likewise, this is a house because it feels like a house, but I don't know where the kitchen is or where the different functioning elements are. In many ways, it's a sort of a geometric arrangement of affordances. And then this, for my dissertation, the piece that I did for my dissertation thesis, as it was called then, which was in many ways a building, and in some ways it's a manifesto. It had no scale. And I had always imagined it as this small thing that you found in the forest floor up in Arthur's Pass in that beech forest in terms of that. Or here, a concept for what became Te Papa. The brief had come out at that time, the students all did that. And it was sort of like half of this design was understood as being a legible, sensible way of organising display spaces and the void, the black areas where everything was stored. And the other half, people understood that I'd gone to the library in a moment of stress and looked through books, and this was actually an Egyptian apartment floor plan that I'd extruded out. And I mean, yes, it was playing with ideas of post-structuralism and all sorts of things such as that. But nonetheless, it's also saying, well, actually, how we label things seems quite arbitrary. And how do we navigate in that? This book, 100 Years of Solitude, early on in there, there's one of the grandmothers, she's losing her memory, and they'd go around and put labels about this is the milk, and this is the milk that comes from the cow, and this is the milk that comes from the cow who has to be fed, and this sort of need of language to somehow give us definition in terms of what we do. Or a thin house where I'm sort of taken everything in my student flat and just laid it all out in sequence in a building. The bit that it was most fascinating, I've got drawing after drawing of these, and they're all done on beautiful paper, hand-drawn, rotring pens. If you make a mistake, you've got to scratch the stuff out. I'd used the perspex from the lift wells to make a light table out of an old chest of drawers laid on its side. But it was kind of like, each of those drawings took some time. Well, here, sort of really letting go of language, a monument to progress, that was the brief. And I really just felt that was so arbitrary that only the person who had set that brief needed to understand it. And so in many ways, it was back at their eyes so that you look back in that space, back at them. So that's the sort of the design sort of whakapapa in some ways that I've come from in terms of, and I mentioned designing because you can see through there it's very much process driven rather than outcome and form. I'm sort of been exploring. But landscape, this idea of immersion, of being lost in places, here up in the Fox Glacier, here as a 9-year-old on the Milford track, a boot in Fiordland as I'm navigating my way through those explorations. And at the bottom of the South Island, starting a very long and very important journey for me, 130 odd days up the South Island on my own, exploring that. And in many ways, this is to be understood in the context of that other work, because letting go of that design work and just going into these places, finding ways down. That's not a photo of a view. That's a photo of the route you're about to take, or the route that you've been on, or here the lake that you've come to, and thinking, how am I going to get around that, and actually having to swim your way around the bottom there and get everything wet and so on. So these are all that sort of sense of not just landscape as scenery, but this thing that we're sort of discovering and connecting with, those typologies, that we have are a struggle. And not just our own stories, of course. Here's someone else's story of something they've left to come and get back up in the wild natives river, many days from any sort of transport or whatever in terms of that. This is a spot that I wrote about, and I called it Being Landscape, and I use this slide a lot. This is halfway up that trip, but it's a self-timed shot. I always ask the question, these footprints in the flow, are they part of that landscape or are they part of me? Where does the landscape start and me finish? And that sense of sort of how that happens. Likewise, not just that walking, but your footwear as well, the devices you use, and so on. And the fact that sort of we're marking landscape and it's affecting us. This, just before I did that trip, a route up Mount Douglas, going up this couloir, and then having to retreat in a really severe storm. And I'll just show this very quickly, but the sense of how our environment not only sort of shapes us, but it actually marks us, and dealing with frostbitten hands and things like that, and sort of those sense that when we look at landscape, we're sort of trying to see this visual thing. And so then, again, these are journeys and routes that I see in that. So that's kind of like my introduction to David Abrams' concept, rather than going through a sort of an academic one, sort of trying to bring that back into actually, we're exploring a process. And I sort of look through sort of the ongoing explorations that go through, and I'm not going to take you through a whole heritage of all the design work, but the different variations of that exploration is taken, in the sort of design and research groups that I've been involved in, both at Otago and here beyond. And so the sort of ways that things have been explored. So that's my introduction into some projects, because I want to sort of start, the purpose for showing it that way is so that you can sort of get a sense that it's sort of the sense of trying to explore and investigate rather than feeling certain of the things that are being found. Things are being found, but I'm curious about those. So the first project I'd like to talk about is Marion College, which I'm involved in the landscape design here, and you can see some pieces of limestone that's become part of the project. Just before I carry on, is there any way we can turn the temperature down here, or is this just normal? Hey? Are you hot? People hot? Yeah, I just feel like I'm going to go for it. Maybe not. I'll do this anyway. Yeah, I'm just thinking. So this has, been a fabulous project, very interesting project. So this is for school. This is, and I'm amazed at the vision of, at the beginning of the people involved who said we could make this into a school, to actually take that on. And so here you can see this facility, the old, it's an old warehouse, which all the goods went out to the different supermarkets, I think, in terms of that. And looking through in terms of the shelters through here and within there. And so this is a project this is Shepherd and Rout, so Jasper and Corson. Josh, this is just, I've got to show this because when they showed this, I just thought this is the most beautiful thing because it's in a building. And so this is a chapel. But because of that, you can laser color all the solar lights, and you can turn off, you can play with the light, and it's making something absolutely magical out of that space. And so this is the sort of the anticipated transformation. I'm not so sure about the brass elements in terms of that, but it's been a fascinating process, and it's I've never been involved with a project so complex of such scale, and seeing how these things are organised. And then as you come out again, this is the architect rendering of the plants, but the sort of the capacity to break down that sort of a veranda foot and see what that might be. And again, their rendering, it feels like there's a lot of colour in terms of those plants. But some of the work we did early on, which was really this idea of inside outside, how do we break this down, and thinking of bigger ground approaches to sort of how those might generate value engineering, meant that some of the things like water and things like that, some of those elements sort of get navigated out. And so in terms of the sort of the master plan that we've been developing in there. And again, I have to show this because it's just opened a whole world up to me of just the complexity. So here, this is one of the easy drawings to read, Shepherd and Route, and there's hundreds of them behind there. I feel very grateful I didn't go down an architecture course, having graduated in architecture, because the level of complexity fries your minds, and then all the revisions and revisions upon revisions, etc. And so I show that because what I come to in this is the sort of the unfinished business, and I welcome conversation in this, because to me it seems the most fascinating part. But again, with the planting aspects, working out how we're going to get these plants developed. And just to explain this, and this in some ways was sort of inspired from the work out of the Eden Project, and having gone to the Eden Project, seeing how plants are real storytellers, and creating this myriad of gardens that are learning places. But that the beginning of the learning is not so much, you know, and they can be broken down into different sections and how they can teach different aspects. But this is the schedule and the vision of perhaps the various, you know, families from the school and church community could be planting and growing up these plants separate to the construction phase. And they've been brought together as a series of events as the school has grown, literally by those efforts as well. But the part that I've sort of sat there and thought how to deal with this, you know, which are the limestone elements, which the limestone has come out of the demolition work of the cathedral, and, you know, how to sort of navigate their, you know, the availability of this material and what's a way of utilising that. And here, looking at the various pieces in storage. And so this is the sort of the question that I still think in terms of this, like the fossil turtle discovered in the Christchurch Church pillar, you know, 80 million years old, and there's a fossil turtle in there. And we tend to see these limestones as a historic element going back to the construction of the cathedral. But to the construction of the land of this place, you know, it's part of that dynamic process. These are millions and millions of sea creatures that have fallen down and become sediment. And so I found incredibly helpful reading this book here from Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, which is sort of talks of, in one part, she talks of this orchid that still lives, and its form is only suited to a certain bee for its pollination, but that bee is now extinct. And so the trace of that bee is just left in that orchid that reproduces itself now. It has no other way of doing it. And that's sort of that memory of that bee within that plant, you know, that memory of that turtle within that pillar. What is that future memory to create with limestone, thinking of it being sea? And, you know, Donna Haraway, I find her fantastic. We can't denounce the world in the name of an ideal world. You know, that we, you know, and I think we often perhaps do that in nature in the sense that we have an ideal understanding of the wild, the wilderness, of nature unspoiled, and we denounce anything that says it's not unspoiled and so on. But we need to survive collaboratively in disturbance and contamination. We need skills for living in the ruins. And this sort of, I find this is a really inspiring, the top one, an inspiring statement about the design process, about what we're sort of trying to do in terms of that. But how to navigate this, and I mean, it's very simple use of it where we were cutting the stones and clean on certain faces, and just so that you could see the erosion of the previous forms, and you could have clean faces that themselves would erode, and not treating it with anything and not making an effort to stop that erosion and people standing on them and wearing them down, and that gradually they'd be just swept down the waterways back into the sea. That sort of slow eroding process rather than carrying it on. But it's sort of been something I've sat and thought about a number of times, thinking what is other, you know, because what is a true way of working with this material that brings in that past rather than just that recent past, because it's easy to use elements as sort of a memory of the cathedral. but how do you bring in that memory of the limestone as well? And, you know, tendo ando, you know, the sort of the negative form in terms of a cross, but in terms of the founder's wall, in terms of that. You know, carry home words in terms of that. You know, the old people used to say, people pass away, but not the land, it remains forever. Maybe that is so. The land changes, the land continues, the sea changes, the sea remains. And so that sort of navigation of that is sort of very much a work in progress in terms of that limestone. Second project, looking into Marlborough, and again, that sort of sea-land interface. Work we've been involved in with Yealands and storytelling in the place, wayfinding, because they have, it's a great place to go to. You can actually drive around unchaperoned through the vineyard and see the vineyard in operation, and well recommend that. Sort of various landscape strategy elements, sort of like big picture potential of that, which brings down to a specific restoration strategy, what to do with the land that is not part of the vineyard, you know, isn't in wine, isn't in vineyard, and how to navigate that as well. And so you have these hillsides that are, in terms of that, have been grazed for, you know, many years, and continue to be grazed as a way of managing that. There's definitely a fire risk associated with that, with that grass as well. Stunning tree here, tree, the only one in the region, hugely mature tongue species. You know, amazing for it to be there in one of those gullies in terms of that. And looking down on the wetland as well, and some of the potential vineyard spaces down there. And so what to plant in this place? And I show this because for starters, there's not a resource of many eco-source seeds. You know, how far away do you go? Likewise, you look at that climate change map up there, what may have belonged there may not be able to grow there in the future, be established as well. And so those ideas of novel ecologies start coming into play, like what are the future ecological forms rather than what's this past Gondwanian thing that we want to create. If you look at Zealandia in Wellington with the kaka, what do the kaka like living and feeding in? It's actually exotic species, you know, the pines and macrocarpus. That's the sort of the species arrangement, that there's their preferred habitat there. You know, and so how do we navigate this future that is perhaps a little bit more complex than this past in terms of, you know, the impacts? And so what we've come up with is really, I mean, it's a expanded view of that sort of randomized planting, where we've actually made a call on different types of planting, different types of seedlings that will be raised in different densities, not based upon a past form, but a sense of, well, some of these will work more strongly than others. And as they establish, some will establish more productively than others and influence those other parts around them. And so what are the sort of the different densities that we would do, and the different scales that we would work with in terms of that? And so how can we sort of, and also in the process creating stories that connect back to some of the wine that's produced as well. So playing some of those forms in terms of that. And sort of how that then comes together as a whole of landscape approach. Also supporting, you know, UN goals, which have since changed, but of 17% of land area being dedicated towards biodiversity outcomes, or that being a primary focus in that area, how we can do that within farm environments rather than alongside them or separate to them. So that's incorporated in as well, and creating that sort of like that interconnected system that we're looking to in terms of that. And so this is something that we recently had published in Curb, looking at a few of these projects in terms of these productive landscapes, in terms of how we might navigate that. And particularly here finding Anna Tsing's work, The Mushroom at the End of the World, which is fantastic in terms of how landscape and species and or bioregions and cultures are all co-produced. There's not one in the service of the other. Each is an expression of the other's activities, and yet by taking a sort of a view around a certain longitude, latitude, which is the round one. Latitude, thank you. At latitude, there's these different places that the forest is found, and so you can go around and she explores that in there. And I think this idea of polyphony is music in which autonomous melodies intertwine. That there's all these different melodies that are taking place. Restoration requires disturbance, but disturbance to enhance diversity and the healthy functioning of ecosystems. Some kinds of ecosystems, advocates argue, flourish with human activities. Again, some of these things that I really feel that we're on the cusp of but enjoying navigating those ideas within Aotearoa, particularly as we move, that the interesting spaces of navigation are not in our conservation places, but actually in those areas alongside them, or where there's high intensity in terms of farming. How do we bring in those aspects? And I love this at the bottom here. To enlarge what is possible, we need other kinds of stories, including adventures of landscapes. That sort of playfulness, exploration that becomes possible in that. Well, the point I also want to make there, and I can't emphasise this enough, and it's come through, you keep coming across this, is that the work coming out of anthropology, human geography, sociology, if you think of, the limits of my language or the limits of my world, they keep turning towards the creative, to the designerly, of saying, look, this is the space where potential can be found in terms of all this work. And it's kind of like an available invitation always in terms of, for us in landscape design, to be able to be exploring that. She's put together with a number of other designers this feral atlas, which is worth exploring in terms of these sort of wild spaces and sort of the new wild, I suppose. And yet I look at those and realise that within our discipline, there is so much capacity to really develop, to work out what are those forms of expression that might be possible, that comes out of the work that she's doing and others in the field. So a brief interlude in the sense of, I've sort of shown you a couple of projects we're working on, but I think, and I showed you the one which is mountain climbing, other places where you realise as you're in the hills that the world is a much bigger place than what we're doing within it. Here, a hut we're set out from, swept down in a rather horrendous avalanche. Here, out on a number of weeks out in Fiordland, wandering about, and here looking at Aotearoa, which had been for a number of years the goal to climb. And in that process of being in these places, you start to see places in different ways. And perhaps, I can remember the first time I went into Fiordland and it was kind of like I saw it in one way. And now when I go there, I see it completely differently. In terms of Aotearoa, by the sixth time I went up there, it was like, I was keen to get there, but I was also had a different view of the place. And for me, getting up there, I got very close to the top and I just went, that's far enough and I don't need any photos. And that was where I wanted to be and headed back. And it made sense to me at the time in terms of just how we were. I mean, I had the opportunity a number of years later to be on the conservation board. I was chair of it for a few years and, doing the conservation management strategy and also involved with developing the draft of the Aotearoa Mount Cook National Park Management Plan. And really people being very generous in bringing into my knowledge and experience the many other ways that Aotearoa can be understood, and the potential in terms of that to open up different ways of seeing this more than human as Abram might call it, but there are many other ways we could determine that as well. And I would strongly recommend that this is probably one of the most important reads in the country in terms of those involved in landscape, is Te Kawa Aotearoa. It's a management plan, but it perhaps presents a much different way of understanding relationships with place and the role of people within those. Te Kawa is about management of people for the benefit of land. It is not about land management. And I'm involved very heavily in protected areas work. And, you know, this is an exhibition that we did a number of years back in Beijing on the story of the development and from a cultural point of view of New Zealand's national parks. And the part that gets the most conversation when you're overseas is this notion of, you know, the legal personhood of the Whanganui River, of Te Aroa, and perhaps Aoraki doesn't have legal personhood, but Aoraki is a living presence as well. And so I come back in terms of my own writing, and while I might have written in Beyond the Scene about being landscape, it seems to me landscape beings is probably what I should have been sort of framing that as. It's not sort of some equal relationship as such, and how do we navigate that? And I bring that in because really, since, you know, the last couple of projects I want to show is projects where I see very much what we're doing is bringing in expertly our skills into things that are of quite a lot of importance, but equally that as designers, we're very much just trying to understand and enable and support what's going on rather than the designer's voice, if that makes sense. And how do we navigate that as well? And so this is work that we did with Sport Taranaki and Walking Access Commission, who's just since the Outdoor Access Commission just recently changed in terms of that. And some of the early sketches of Taranaki, this was just tracing all the waterways out to the ocean and realising that, you know, while in a certain way of seeing it, it's the national park, Taranaki, of course, is not. He's much more encompassing than that. And so in terms of what's the tracks and trails strategy, how do you identify where the investment should take place? You know, what's the story that brings all this together? And of course, it relates to the journey of Taranaki. And so us writing down what had been shared in terms of that. And so that wherever we are, we're always on the mountain and in its embrace. And so what then are the sort of the amenity trails, you know, and what's their function in terms of that? And so we came up with a program that wasn't about climbing Taranaki, it was about journeys around the monga. And some of them, the first two are the ones that most excited me, which is youth programs. So this for year one to year 8 school kids, each year going to a different part as they go around and spend a day at different places as they create that connection. Here, in a teenage sense of going on a self, you know, as a cohort going around on a single journey, that creating those aspects, that the landscape design is not one of facility making, it's one of program development. But equally, how these other aspects connect in as well. And that all together are about creating this movement of people, and it's a movement of people, you know, around the monga in terms of that. And then that led on to our involvement in sort of developing material to support the co-design process which is currently underway in terms of the Taranaki crossing, which is a major walk that's being developed with iwi. And again, you know, the things that that came through that sort of ongoing process in terms of that, you know, the purpose of a trail is not as sort of as a great walk, but has a much deeper possibility and potential. And it's not a potential that needs to be led out of perhaps a landscape architecture discipline, but it's that our role is just to support as and when it's called in. In terms of why, in terms of various Tataio species and so on. And so what is an experience that enables that? And so how do you sort of assist the process in terms of its ongoing movement? And, you know, I had to come away with some of the existing material here which had been put in by the Department of Conservation or precursors. And in many ways, it's just to remove the stuff. That actually it's just to respect taranaki and bring into that. It's not about a design intervention, it's a design de-intervention, or whatever the right preposition is. And then finally, the project I'd like to sort of bring is one that's sort of, it's a very, being a very intimate project, and it's working with a whānau trust in the Waikato. And again, it's like, how do we describe possibility and intent? And we have plans and we have images, and we often think that the image itself is somehow the description of this. And in this project, it's very much this is the design, and then the description is the thing that's put down on a 3D sort of, you know, oblique view. I just show this too, though, in terms of, you know, some lovely work in terms of waterways, that seeing a river not as a channel, but as a much broader sense of that. And again, some of the things that have been written about that come to. But here you can see sort of our design, which was about the waterway, about various activities that are taking place, you know, recreation activities, gardening, and, you know, gardens and what have you. And it's sort of like, to me, they seem to be the powerful design elements, but equally how they might play out is, you know, this is the, I think bringing it into a time base actually helps to sort of understand that sort of movement or that dynamism of landscape, rather than it's sort of like being this plan as if this finished outcome, that actually, you know, in more time sort of you could have the people moving, have people moving within that, the process of making and being made by landscape, you know, whether that's the whenua in terms of footprints in the snow, which is which, there is no distinction, that it's how those things come together. And so while that's all captured in a plan, it seems, you know, what is the way of both designing it and presenting, you know, in a way of inviting others into that. So yeah, I'll come back to these sort of images here, and, you know, yes, these are the different stages along the bottom, but the capacity of what it is we're designing, and, you know, you see the work along here that we focus on the plan and the organisation of space rather than the activation of community and people, and what is our role in terms of doing that. So those are 4 current projects. I want to just finish with final thing, which is tools. And it's just one tool I'd like to share, and it's work done by a colleague, you know, Woody Lee, who's, you know, worked with for a number of many years, really, in terms of that. And I totally, you know, his dissertation where he explored this aspect of, I suppose, people ecology interactions. And here you can see Prominski's organisation of things, and it's kind of like a chaotic mess, and it's kind of like, what are tools with which we can be bringing together both the sense of landscape and those activities. Now, I've as you know, I've always found Tim Ingold's work fascinating and very useful, and is splitting between landscape and taskscape, which are the activities and how they might be navigated. And I can think of work that Kate Blackburn did a while ago with dealing with tensions and putting it into that matrix. Even before that, Katie Miller did in terms of experiences being involved. What Woody did was quite fascinating in the sense that he brought in interactivity between them and tried to navigate that, and so you could organise that. So you can see that he was describing here, not in terms of the Tiki Islands, in terms of like this, but that this is this whole capacity in terms of that. And it's kind of like, well, what becomes possible with that? And we applied this approach with a trail strategy in the North Waikato area. You know, this vision that the Waikato River Authority has, you know, for a healthy river and it sustains abundant life. How do we design, how do trails work in support of that? And so what is that system? And I just wanted to show, you know, and this is what we're dealing with, motorways that cut off the awa from the landscape and so on, you know, faster lanes, faster travel, all of those tensions. There is a river over here somewhere, but you've got a railway and 4 lanes and what have you going through. And using this model, adapting this, you know, you've got social prosperity, economic prosperity. Often people will come and say, hey, we just need a great walk or something iconic to activate the place. And it's the wrong way of building that up. And so again, here, this idea of how we can sort of script, I suppose, different activities that in time create that sort of building of value, so that by the end, yes, you've got this capacity to create that economic well-being, but it's come out of that sort of platform. And I'm just showing this as what we've found is a really useful tool for people to understand why it is that when people are saying, oh, come in and design a site, we're thinking actually what's a program of action, of which the site as a landscape, as things to organise, is just part of that, but that actually it's about in terms of people as well. And so out of that came various strategies and various foundation projects. And this sort of all in support of this idea of the, you know, the river itself being a single indivisible being that flows. And this is out of the Settlement Act, but it's a wonderful description of the Waikato. So thank you.